Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Nader Hashemi, director of the Alawite Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, The Syria Dilemma, Secularization, Mapping New Politics of the Middle East, and a 4-volume study on Islam and human rights, Critical Concepts in Islamic Studies. His next book is on the global divide over Israel and Palestine. I welcome Nader Hashemi to Savage Minds. Nader, you were born in Canada but lived in Iran for 3 years as a teenager during the 1979 revolution. How did that first-hand experience of a revolutionary society shape your political worldview?
Well, I'm a child of immigrant parents who moved from Iran to Canada in the late 1960s. My early formative years were in the 1970s. And like most immigrants, you live between two worlds. The world that your parents have come from and the home environment and the community that they establish with other immigrants. And then the world of Canadian secular society, emphasis on the word secular, that shaped my education, my upbringing, what I was observing and absorbing from broader mainstream Canadian culture. So that experience, produced a set of emerging intellectual challenges and tensions in my own intellectual development that revolved around questions of secularism, the question of democracy and its relationship to development, and especially the role of religion. My parents and the community that we were raised in, I'm talking about the early emerging Canadian Muslim community, had an identity that was deeply shaped by religion and a view that religion could be a positive element in the construction of a socially just society. It could provide answers to the problems plaguing Muslim societies back home, and it need not be marginalized and removed from the public sphere in the context of, fighting for a better, more equitable and just world. In other words, I was exposed to an understanding of religion that was both foundational to my emerging identity, but that was constructed and presented as a positive force and a universalist sort of view of humanity that could bring people together, solve problems, and fight social injustice. And so that tension between my upbringing at home, the community that I was being raised in, largely by immigrants who had a positive view of religion writ large, and then the broader secular society that I was living in Canada, eventually produced a set of questions in my mind about, what is the normative relationship between, religion and democracy. What does this concept of secularism actually mean? Can Muslim majority societies undergo a political transformation that can adapt religion, in this case Islam, to modern concepts of democracy, citizenship, human rights? And it was those questions that were a byproduct of my immigrant experience that eventually crystallized in my mind when I decided to pursue higher education at university and then do a graduate degree. And when it came to a dissertation topic, these were the questions that, were at the forefront of my mind. And I was very lucky to get accepted into a very good PhD program at the University of Toronto, where I spent 5 years really exploring specifically these questions, the relationship between religion, secularism, and liberal democracy. In fact, that was the official title of my doctoral dissertation that I wrote at the University of Toronto in the Department of Political Science.
And you mentioned that you were a rebellious kid who hated moving to Iran at 13. Looking back, what moral or intellectual tensions from that time still drive your research today?
Yeah, that's correct. So the Iranian Revolution was a transformative moment in my personal life. People forget that that revolution was widely viewed by many people in Iran as a movement for emancipation from dictatorship and tyranny. And my father was very political. He was a supporter of the Iranian nationalist leader Mohammad Mossadegh, who was toppled in the CIA coup in 1953. And so when the revolution happened, our family moves back to Iran. When most people were leaving Iran, we were moving in the other direction. And so we land in Iran shortly after the revolution, just a few weeks before the Iran-Iraq war started, and the country was in full-scale debate and argument over, the future of Iran. What does this revolution mean? What does it mean to have religion as a powerful force in society, in political power? Can religion and democracy, in this case Islam and democracy, be reconciled? How do you resolve deep and long-standing tensions between tradition and the demands of modern citizenship? Where do women's rights fit into this equation? Where do minority rights fit into this equation? What should Iran's relationship be with the Western world? This was a revolutionary moment. So there was a lot of, everywhere you went, I remember trying to go to sleep at night when we first landed there and hearing my father and family members debating in very loud voices till the wee hours of the morning, all of these questions. So I was old enough to sort of at least not fully understand what was happening and what was being said, but at least, I was able to try. I was old enough to, have a broad sense of what was going on. And as I got older, looking back, I was able to put the pieces together. And so, that experience as a very, teenager was very formative in terms of my shaping my, trajectory. But of course, I was also a 13-year-old, right? So I wanted to do what other 13-year-old kids were doing, and that was, having fun, hanging out with my friends. I wasn't happy that, we had to move back. I was a very rebellious and angry child. And I caused my parents immense grief. I hope I've made up for it over the years, but those are some of my memories. I eventually, found friends in school who had sort of a similar story as myself. In other words, living between two worlds. And looking back, I think that experience of living in early post-revolutionary Iranian society was the best education that one could ask for. Not only was I exposed to Iran, life and politics and society in a revolutionary setting, but a country that was still a developing society. I got to meet my relatives. My father has a huge family, most of whom I had not known. I was able to learn a new language and really understand the world that we live in from the perspective of post-revolutionary Iran, with all of these tensions and tribulations and debates sort of revolving around me, So that was the background. Again, I have distinct memories of not wanting to move to Iran, wanting to leave very quickly. There was actually one moment when I attempted to run away and to go back to Canada without my parents' permission, and it caused a little bit of a family controversy. It wasn't a very serious effort, but I think it was an attempt to send a message to my dad that I wasn't happy. But I was there for 3 years, And eventually, because the Iran-Iraq War was in full swing and I was approaching military conscription age, my family sent myself and my sister back to Canada, in my case, to finish high school, and my sister, who was just starting university in Canada, and then gradually the rest of my immediate family moved back.
And so you didn't grow up speaking Farsi then?
My parents spoke it in the home, and I understood some of it. My sister was better than I was, my elder sister. So I understood it, but we spoke to my parents in English, and but we could understand, the Farsi that was spoken to us. And my mother did try to teach us the basic elements of the language, which I had a basic grasp of in terms of the alphabet and basic simple words. But yeah, I didn't grow up speaking it. It wasn't until I went to Iran where I learned the language fully, by virtue of that experience.
You credit the late John Sigler as your academic hero. What specifically about his approach as a public intellectual is part of your own academic DNA?
Yeah, so John Sigler was a professor of political science at Carleton University. He was an American. He worked in the U.S. government, in the American military, eventually ends up getting a PhD from the University of Southern California with a specialization in comparative politics, international relations, and Middle East studies. And John Sigler, it just ends up in Ottawa, Canada, at Carleton University, and he becomes a mentor of mine. I went to Carleton to study with him for my master's degree, and he was just an intellectual superstar, just on a personal level, just a wonderful human being. He was, he came from Indiana, and he took religion very seriously, and he also understood it in an American context, in a global context, but also in a Middle East context. And so, unlike many professors, he had a deep understanding and sensitivity to questions of religion and its relationship to politics, which is one reason why I related to him. He was an expert in the Israel-Palestine conflict, which was a deep interest of mine as well. And he was just a brilliant professor, a teacher. He had this unique ability. When you would go into his office during office hours, you would go there for 10, 15 minutes, in my case, often an hour, and you'd come out of that meeting with John Sigler just feeling incredibly encouraged about the world you live in, your potential, your intellectual interests. He would really push you in the classroom, and the workload was very heavy, but you emerged from studying under him much more educated and informed about the world. And John Sigler was not just a professor, but he was a public intellectual, as you rightly noted. He was always on television. He was always giving talks to civil society organizations. One thing he told me, he didn't tell me, he told an audience, but whenever you get a chance to engage with an audience about issues of global concern, you should always take advantage of it to try and change how people think, inform, and educate them, even if it's a small audience. He was always, every time, I was a student activist as well, every time we organized an event, a lecture series, he was more than willing to engage with us, to attend, to participate, of course, completely pro bono. We weren't paying him, but he had a public presence. He was always on CBC television and radio. He was influential in policy circles, and he, inspired a whole generation of people who studied under him. My only regret is I didn't do my PhD with him. I only did my master's. I came to Carleton just for a couple of years to do my master's. I ended up staying a lot longer because there was a very attractive intellectual environment that I was able to create, in part because of John Sigler's presence there as an intellectual anchor. And so he was a huge influence on me. Especially, I would just audit his classes, and I'd sit in his various classes just to learn from him. And it was just his style of teaching, the way he pushed his students, really informed my own pedagogical approach to learning and education. And I said at one point that every time I step into a classroom, I think of John Sigler. And now it's especially a poignant moment for me when I teach, because I'm teaching now at Georgetown University, and that's the university that John Sigler also studied at. He did his master's degree there, and his early exposure to Middle East studies was through his education at Georgetown and his affiliation with several professors from the Middle East, particularly Hisham Sharabi, who was a prominent Palestinian intellectual and scholar who John Sigler studied under. And so it's when I walk around campus, I often think, are these the hallways? Is this the classroom that John Sigler studied in? Because I feel his presence in every time I'm teaching and engaging with students.
You shifted from sciences and engineering to the social sciences as an undergraduate. What was the light bulb moment that led you toward political science and philosophy?
That's where my intellectual interests were. Coming from an immigrant family, I had no one in my immediate family or even in the broader community that my parents were part of that could mentor someone like me who had natural interests in the social sciences and humanities. You're an immigrant. You're told that, look, the safe jobs are the ones that have job security. So you go to medicine, you go to engineering, or perhaps law. So I had to just figure it out. I was a fairly good student. I was competent in the basic maths and sciences. So I did what everyone else was doing in my age group. You do the sciences and you hope to get into a professional school. But of course, I took electives that were in history and political science. I really enjoyed it. I didn't understand or even know in my first few years that you could make a career in the social sciences. In my case, political science and political philosophy. I had to sort of figure it out. It extended my undergraduate education by a few years, but it was just a natural fit for me, given where my intellectual interests lie. And I remember back in high school, I was the courses that I enjoyed the most were history and geography. So, I guess the one of the big transformations were professors that I met at university. In this case, the University of Western Ontario. There were some very good professors who mentored me in the direction of political science, and I learned from them that you can actually, if you work hard, make a career out of it. So that's how it happened.
Excuse me. In your book, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, you argue for a democratic theory for Muslim societies. Now, a lot of people listening to this show will not know about concepts such as Arabization, or I believe that's what it's called in English. I've studied it in French as Arabisation, which was very important, especially in the Maghreb. I'm wondering if you could discuss how you might take the model of the Western world of secularism, of what many people in the West believe to be secularist, and how that is often viewed with such suspicion in the Muslim world, and perhaps vice versa, because we saw a lot of this popping out of the media. I'm roughly the same age as you, so when the revolution happened in Iran, all of a sudden, we had moved from Canada to the United States, and I saw the effect of not only the revolution itself, but more so it was the way the media portrayed this as a bunch of radical, regressive people from a barbaric civilization, zero regard for what secularism even meant at the time in the Deep South where we were living. So there's a lot of irony there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is very much what drove me to write my doctoral dissertation, is to try and reconcile, the understanding that I had of secularism in my Western education and upbringing as effectively being this concept and this idea and this political principle that was associated with goodness, with development, with equality, with democracy and progress. How do I reconcile that concept of secularism with the way I understood and saw secularism manifesting itself in the minds of many people, not just in Iran, but in the broader Arab and Islamic world, where secularism for them was not a synonym for equality, social justice, and democracy. Secularism was associated in the minds of many people with political tyranny, with despotism, with alienation. And so just consider the case of, Iran. The political system that was in power in Iran up to the 1979 revolution was a monarchy, a pro-Western monarchy that was whose political identity was shaped by a distinct secular understanding of what Iranian identity could be and should be, a particular form of secular nationalism, where religion was, not excluded, but was certainly marginalized. The model of development that was promoted by the Iranian state under the Pahlavi monarchy with backing from the West was an understanding of secularism that purported to be forward-looking, that purported to advance development and represent progress. But objectively speaking, that regime was a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship. And so in the minds of many Iranians, and this can be extended across much of the Arab and Islamic world, secularism in many cases was associated not with emancipation and democracy, but with the tyranny and repression of the post-colonial state, often backed by external powers. So some of the most repressive and brutal, regimes in the post-colonial world in the Middle East were overtly and proudly secular political systems. I'm thinking specifically of Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Bashar al-Assad Syria, both the father and the son. And often those political leaders and regimes would loudly proclaim that they're secularist. But those regimes were, objectively speaking, political tyrannies. So there was that tension that was there in my upbringing and trying to sort of understand, just the historical origin and evolution of the concept, what's good about secularism, what's problematic about secularism when it comes to politics, was something that I wanted to research and understand. And so I've written extensively about this topic, both theoretically and practically. And the experience of living in Iran helped me sort of think about these issues at a much more deeper level. So that's some of the background to my intellectual interests. You're right about the picture that you painted about post 1979 Iran and how the Iranian Revolution and the revolutionaries were effectively portrayed as howling savages from another world. A lot of that had to do, though, with simply questions of political power and empire, because the Shah was the West's favorite ally in the region, the backer, purchaser of Western arms, the defender of Western interests. And of course, when he was toppled, to the shock of everyone in the West, no one saw it coming. There was this deep sense of anger that a very loyal ally had been toppled in a popular revolution. And so the revolutionaries were just, by that, from that perspective alone, portrayed as enemies of the West and of Western civilization. And it was easy to do that when the revolutionaries, many of them, the ones that were leading the revolution, had a religious identity and were calling for the introduction of, the emergence or the fusion of religion and politics. This just shocked the West on two levels: politically, from the perspective of power and empire, but also from the perspective of the secular assumptions that informed what constituted modernity and development. Up until that point, there was this view that, look, religion was a problem for society. There was nothing good that could come out of it. It had to be marginalized, privatized, and the introduction of religion in the public sphere was just a synonym for disaster and for chaos. So drawing upon that deep secular bias and the fact that there was a loss of political power and influence in the Middle East because of the toppling of pro-Western dictatorship, this allowed for a very easy and reductive portrayal of what was happening in Iran without any, understanding, number one, of the legitimate grievances that Iran had against the United States and the West for supporting a brutal dictator for 25 years and toppling a democratic movement. in 1953. But also there was no ability to sort of, I think, rethink philosophically how religion and democracy might be able to coexist. Um, and to also, look back on different moments and different ideas in the West's own political development that are largely ignored, where religion did actually contribute. Certain manifestations and interpretations of religion actually did contribute to democratic development. So those are the issues that I ended up studying and focusing on. And of course, it was wonderful that my parents were Iranian, in the sense that there was a revolution that took place, and I was at the center of it, at least in my early formative years. I was living it. I was in the middle of it, and I was able to sort of absorb all of these things, which helped, fine tune my own intellectual interest and my understanding, historically, theoretically, but also practically, and in terms of applying these broad questions and debates to a real live case study.
Yes, and it's also interesting to me because when you study Middle Eastern studies or anything to do with the Middle East, one of the first things you learn is that the Arab world is not every Muslim country. And the way, as you know this well, in the media in the West, most Americans and Canadians conflate Arabo-Islamic culture. They really don't understand any of the history. Most don't even understand the importance of decolonization from Algeria, or even the importance of a figure like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, much less understand the interstices between countries such as Iran or Afghanistan and the various colonizations that have taken place over the past 100 plus years. In the case of Algeria, that was colonized by France for almost 150 years. So when people say, why are those people not angry with their governments? Or Trump scratching his chin, wondering why Iranians have not revolted against their government. It's amazing to me because there seems to be an aporia of historical knowledge or even common sense. Because if you attack someone and you attack a leader, even if the people dislike, and they're being bombed, they're not going to react favorably to the aggressor.
That's all correct. Look, there's several things going on here. One, there's just general ignorance about how the world operates. There's a lot of Eurocentrism or, Western-centric understandings of how things in the Middle East evolve. A lot of this is driven by the fact that the United States and the West are not a neutral and innocent player in the region. They have deep interests. They have allies. The Israel-Palestine conflict is a big part of it. It distorts understandings, Western understandings of the Middle East in very catastrophic ways because of the historic Western support and sensitivity to his Jewish suffering, and then support for the state of Israel, and then an inability to comprehend or understand at a genuine level why there's so much anger and resentment toward Israel in the Arab and Islamic world. And that, that extends right up until today. I could just to pick up on one thing that you said, when Donald Trump began the attack on Iran on February the 28th, he had a long list of grievances against Iran. He began with the Iranian seizure of the American embassy in Tehran in November 1979, claiming that this was the first salvo and the attack that Iran had launched against the West, Western civilization, etc. Completely ignored in that historical recounting of grievances that Donald Trump listed was the fact that in 1979, the Iranian embassy was seized by revolutionaries. But there was a political and historical context to that event that is rarely discussed or understood in the Western debate over Iran. And the context was American and British toppling of democracy in Iran in the 1950s, the restoration of a dictator to political power, and the United States' very overt and, I would argue, criminal role in backing a brutal dictator who had a notorious secret police against the wishes of the vast majority of Iranians that exploded in a revolution in 1979. And so one can understand from that perspective why there was a lot of people that were angry at the United States. Yes, the seizure of the U.S. embassy was a egregious breach of international law. But it's not like these Iranian revolutionaries woke up one day and said, "Look, we have nothing better to do. Let's go seize the American embassy and keep the personnel hostage." There was a context. There was a story. The trigger event that led to that embassy seizure was Jimmy Carter's decision to allow the Shah of Iran, who had fled the country in the context of the revolution, into the United States, evoking a sense of deja vu for many Iranian people that the United States is plotting again to intervene in Iran and topple the Islamic Republic that had just been set up. And so when you hear Donald Trump, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's actually the broader intellectual debate, it's other Western leaders, complain that Iran is the big destabilizing force in the region. There's no understanding of the destabilizing role, number one, of how other countries in the region are deeply destabilizing. I mean, nobody talks about the destabilizing role of Arab dictatorships, particularly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and the list goes on and on. The policies of those governments are not considered to be destabilizing because they're allied with the West. So by definition, what those countries do are not considered to be destabilizing. They're considered to be advancing Western interests in the region. Then there's the role of the West itself in terms of its intervention in the region and how that has created deep instability. I wrote a piece at the beginning of this war where I sort of went through the arguments, and I was just looking up some basic data on the recent history of the Middle East, and the Brown University's cost of war project has listed a figure of roughly 4 to 5 million people who have been killed directly and indirectly post 9/11 as a result of American intervention in the Middle East. So just think about that figure, 4 to 5 million people killed in the last roughly 20, 25 years in the Middle East because of American intervention. And then we're told that only Iran is the destabilizing player in the region, nobody else. So when you look at the data and the evidence, it's quite shocking what you will discover. So yeah, there is this interpretation and framing of events in Iran today that are very ahistorical, that are very much shaped from the perspective of American empire with the attempt to control and dominate. And so just to cite an interesting example, Donald Trump and Netanyahu were claiming that they want to liberate the Iranian people, that, they've started this war, hoping that there would be a popular uprising. But, just ask yourself, when has Donald Trump or Netanyahu or any European leader or any Canadian leader or any Australian leader ever expressed hope for democracy and human emancipation for the other peoples in the Middle East? In Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Morocco, in Jordan. There's absolutely none of that discourse. And those people are also living under political dictatorships. And what we know is, not too long ago when the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, there was a lot of trepidation in Western capitals. Joe Biden famously said in the lead up to the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt, when he was asked whether Hosni Mubarak, the longstanding dictator, was a dictator, he refused to call him a dictator. He said, no, he's an ally, he's a friend, of the United States. So there is this construction and framing of the politics of the Middle East that objectively distorts what's going on and presents a narrative and interpretation that reflects Western economic and security interests in the Middle East that have nothing to do with democracy and human rights, but have everything to do with advancing the goals of empire and advancing political control over the Middle East. So I think one has to understand the region and the narrative that we hear in the West from that perspective, because if you don't, and you just are going to sort of internalize a framework and discourse that's shaped by the establishment media and by existing Western governments, you're going to fundamentally misunderstand the sources of instability in the region. And then you're going to start unconsciously repeating sort of a framework that doesn't advance human understanding. It'll, in fact, distort it.
The colonial rhetoric of long ago, let's say pre-1959, it has only morphed. It hasn't really changed, in my opinion. Seeing the way, when I moved back to Canada as a professor at the University of Montreal, I was shocked by the way Canadians referred to the Indigenous as if calling them First Nations. It's all about linguistic betterment, but material conditions zero. And I thought, interesting. You've given them a better name than in the States. It sounds royal, doesn't it? First. But there seems to be this unconscious that has not left Europeans, North Americans at all. Zero. And we saw this in the way that Gaza has been reported upon. The ahistoricization of not only what has happened since 7 October, but since the founding of that country, if you can call it founding, is astonishing because when you start to speak to people, especially I've been having a lot of discussions with British feminists who seem to take the side of the genociders. And a lot of this stems from historical ignorance. Because, again, people are unaware that what happened in Iran in 1953, what happened in you could go across a timeline and just country after country had coup d'etats, soft coups, either directly or indirectly. We've seen this now recently with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. And the propaganda, of course, is evil Russia. But the same rules are not applied, are they, to Israel? So you can encroach upon anyone's territory. If it's southern Lebanon, go ahead. No one will say anything. And I think this all fits together, really, in terms of the way history has been taught to us in the West. I grew up, again, after the age of 10 in the U.S., and we were not taught about Arabization. We were not taught about decolonization. And I know the textbooks have somewhat changed since, but there seems to be a problem, like you just mentioned the Green Revolution, the way that people in the West think of that as wanting to be like them. And a lot of people in the West don't understand. Well, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine has made this film called Palestine 36. And I watched it last night with my children because I really want them to understand, aside from the news I work on, the reality of humanity. And you see the opening scene is this beautiful train station in Palestine. And you're seeing Palestinians operating under normal life conditions. And they're seeing these boats come over with Jews from Europe. And a little girl asks her mother, why are they coming over? And the mother says, because they're not wanted in their countries. And you see over the course of this film, the way that the openness of Palestinians turned into their worst enemy, their own colonization. And I think a similar tactic happens intellectually within the way that Western media portrays what is going on in these countries. So we're not told that Iran might have rational disagreements with what has been going on around them and towards them for many decades. No, we're taught they are backwards. This is really the subtext here. They need to, free their women. I was living in Bologna when 9/11 happened, and I will never forget stepping into the Feltrinelli store near my house. Within 24 hours, they had an Islam section up. And in the Islam section was a book, and you'll know this book, Not Without My Daughter. And of course, it has nothing to do with anything that was going on around 9/11, but let's just throw that book up there to show that helping these countries is helping the women. And you've seen this being rolled out even in Gaza. The children that were allegedly killed was used, similar to what was done to legitimate Iraq too, but also the rape of women in Gaza. So we're getting a lot of propaganda about women's rights suddenly. And I'm thinking, wait, you're not saying anything about the women in Saudi Arabia who could only drive since recently.
Yeah, those are good observations. Look, the first thing I would say is that I think the younger generation of students that I engage with now in my classrooms, they're much more critical of these historical biases and distortions. They're much more sensitive to the whole question of indigenous rights, the genocide of the indigenous population in the Western Hemisphere. On the question of Israel, there's been just a sea change in terms of attitudes. In fact, when I'm in the classroom, I often play devil's advocate just to stimulate conversation, and I'm the one who has to defend, the Israeli position on what it's doing in the region in response to my students who are very critical, because this is the generation where Gaza is the big moral litmus test for anyone who claims to have a moral position in the world. And these kids have been raised against the backdrop of what they've seen in Gaza, and so on all of these issues of the question of historical injustice and the treatment of marginalized peoples, whether we're talking about the centrality and the horrors of slavery, or the plight of the indigenous populations, or the problem of settler colonialism, both in the past and its modern manifestation in the West Bank and Gaza today. All of my students, I think, just at a basic level, accept that. It's non-controversial. There's an attempt now by the Trump administration to sort of remove any references to the term settler colonialism, because as we're seeing right now from the Trump administration and from the Israeli government, they're very much trying to create a world that goes back to 19th century imperialism, where these values and these policies can be, implemented and accepted. So I think there have been positive changes, but yeah, I think at the establishment media level, at the policy level, I think the legacy of colonialism and imperialism still lingers on. And for me, it's so crystal clear in the context of Western policy in the Middle East, where everything that Iran does is considered to be catastrophic and destabilizing, but things that other countries do in the region that are sometimes equally as bad as Iranian government repression or regional intervention is either ignored or sometimes funded. And so just to say one example, the United Arab Emirates is presented as sort of a model state in the Middle East that is, very close to Western strategic interests, coordinates its foreign policy closely with the United States, has very warm relations with Israel. It has created this sort of Las Vegas in the Middle East and gets a lot of, positive publicity. But the same family dictatorship that runs the United Arab Emirates is right now engaged in a genocide in Sudan by arming and backing the leading, genocidal rapid support forces that have committed, horrific massacres that constitute a genocide. And there's been reporting on this, but there's been no policy shift, right? So, and then of course the state of Israel, even in the context of the genocide in Gaza, which is still ongoing, of course, at a lower level, that every Western government, including Canada, continue to ship arms to Israel right up until the so-called ceasefire that was implemented last October. Whether it was Biden or whether it was Trump, notwithstanding an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. I'm just at one example. I was here in Washington, D.C. We're in the middle of a genocide. Netanyahu comes to the United States. He's hosted by the U.S. Congress, and in a special joint session of the U.S. Congress in the middle of a genocide, he gives a talk where he gets 61 standing ovations. And I know it's 61 standing ovations because I got my research assistant to watch the talk and to count how many times people stood up and applauded Netanyahu. And I think, I think most young people see the hypocrisy, see the double standards. And one reason why the double standards, as you said, are so glaring is because what's happening in Gaza today is juxtaposed to what's happening in Ukraine, where Russia's attack, intervention, active aggression, and occupation of Ukraine is rightly called out as a breach of international law that constitutes war crimes, and there has to be an ICC, International Criminal Court investigation, and arrest warrant for Putin, all of which I agree. But when those exact same things, in many ways much worse things, happen at the same time in Gaza, the same Western leaders who were standing on their moral high horse and calling out Putin are doing the exact opposite in the context of Gaza. In fact, when South Africa took Israel to the World Court and charged it with genocide, and they got a provisional ruling saying, yes, there's a plausible case that Israel has engaged in a grave breach of the UN Genocide Convention. Every Western leader said they're not going to follow the World Court. The International Court of Justice doesn't apply here. And then a few months later, when the International Criminal Court famously indicted three leaders of Hamas, but also two senior Israeli leaders, including Netanyahu, a similar response came that they're not going to implement it. They don't recognize it. The court has overstepped its bounds. How dare the International Criminal Court try to make any equivalency between Hamas and Netanyahu? And in fact, in one famous statement, which we now know has now become part of the public record, a leading American senator, in this case Senator Lindsey Graham, told the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, that, look, this International Criminal Court, I'm paraphrasing what he said, this International Criminal Court was supposed to go after African leaders, not Western leaders. Like, what's going on here? And so this just exposes the gross hypocrisy and the claims of universality and human rights and the rule of law. We hear this phrase, rules-based order. It never objectively existed. It certainly doesn't exist now. But I think thanks in part to social media and to just a much more healthier skepticism among young people, people can call out and see, the gross hypocrisy. And just one last point on this issue. What was so interesting and revealing to me is that when the genocide in Gaza began in the spring of 2024, you had this Gaza encampment movement that began in the United States and then spread around the world. What was so interesting is that this Gaza encampment movement, which is basically an anti-genocide movement, right, to call Western governments to stop their support for genocide, it was organized by young people against not just the stated official position of their governments, but of all of the establishment media that had basically bent in the direction of Israel. But young kids were able to see what was happening in Gaza, reject the narrative of the American government, the Canadian government, the British government, reject the narrative of the dominant legacy media and newspapers and magazines like The Economist, and come to an understanding of what was happening in Gaza by focusing on alternative media, seeing what's happening in Gaza through their iPhones and their, Android phones, and then come to a realization that something really grotesque is going on here, and they mobilized around it. So the fact that these young kids were able to penetrate and bypass this standard narrative over what was happening in Gaza, which effectively was a pro-Israel Netanyahu narrative, gives me hope that young people can't be duped and misinformed like they were in previous generations. There's healthier skepticism, there's greater awareness, there's more education, and now there's alternative sources of information that people can get that can challenge what they're hearing from their elected leaders.
As much as I dislike certain parts of the internet, certainly social media is where I lay a lot of my criticism. At the same time, it's been excellent for all this. And I feel like we're living in two different realities. And the political leaders still think Fox and MSNBC matter when science, if you believe in numbers, disagree with them. And younger generations, even our own now, everyone's turning towards social media to get their news. They distrust legacy media entirely. And so it's almost as if there's now an information war being launched within everyone's societies against the corporations that 20 years ago had the power to propagandize and today are toothless.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with you on the social media pros and cons. We're roughly the same age cohort. I remember growing up, the only sources of information that you had, well, in Canada, it was basically just the CBC, maybe CTV. In the United States, there's three major networks. And then it was the establishment newspapers, right? New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Then in Canada, the Globe and Mail, I guess the Toronto Star. That was it. There was no other source of information that you could get. This was in the pre-internet era. You had Reuters, but you only had what you could access on television, which was limited number of mostly legacy establishment media. And then you had the establishment newspapers, and then maybe a few dissident publications, like when I was growing up, like The Nation or The Progressive, or, but those were, very marginal niche publications that didn't have broad reach. But that was it. If you wanted to understand the world, those was your sources. But thanks to social media, things have changed, at least in terms of information. There's a lot wrong about social media. It does create, echo chambers. And now with all this AI generated stuff, it's hard to know what's truth and what's not. So one has to really be vigilant in terms of checking sources before one reaches an understanding of what's happening. But clearly, just going back to the example of the Gaza encampment protests, it was kids seeing things from the alternative media sources, what was happening in Gaza on their phones, and then mobilizing around it, which, is, in my view, a fundamentally healthy development, that students can get their own education that can challenge establishment narratives coming from government and from the media, and then take, a corrective course of action to try and affect change.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. And you've written extensively on the Green Movement in Iran. What lessons from that 2009 uprising are most relevant to the women life freedom protests of today?
Well, for your listeners who don't recall or remember and know what the Green Movement was all about, in 2009, there was a presidential election in Iran, and the forces of political reform gathered and mobilized and backed a candidate that ran on a platform of reforming the Islamic Republic, not toppling it, but at least democratizing it within the framework of the existing constitution. And there was a mass mobilization, a major voter turnout at the time, and everything suggested that the reformist candidate was about to win, which would have represented a major sea change in Iranian politics. The authoritarian Iranian regime, the hardliners, the IRGC mobilized to effectively fake the election results and crack down on civil society and on the opposition, to arrest them and claim they were all, duped or defending the interests of the United States in Iran. And there was a brutal period of repression that took place. And that event effectively ended a period of time that really started, I would believe, in the 1990s, roughly a 20-year period, if you will, where political reform was very much on the intellectual agenda, political agenda in Iran, and it was clear that the Iranian establishment would not tolerate that, and so politics then shifted in a different direction. It shifted in a direction of more repression. There was a sort of a breakaway movement, one could argue, from the reform period, where pragmatist politicians come to power in Iran, headed by this Iranian president by the name of Hassan Rouhani, who says that, look, the biggest issue facing Iran is the nuclear question. And he actually is able to secure a nuclear deal with the United States. But then opposition politics is sort of fragmented. And there was a series of uprising and protests after the Green Movement in 2009, in 2017, in 2019, and then critically in 2022, when you have this women life freedom movement that emerges in Iran, when a young woman is arrested in a subway station in Iran for allegedly improper wearing the hijab. She's killed, and it produces a 4-month grassroots uprising led largely by women that results in the death of at least 500 people. And Iran is rocked once again over protests for human rights and freedom, particularly revolving around the status of women. And the connection between the Green Movement of 2009 and the Women Life Freedom Movement of 2022 is that you have a very deeply entrenched authoritarian state that is not willing to relinquish control and is willing to use brute force to maintain control. What happens critically in 2022 And what's different about the 2022 Women Life Green Movement, the Women Life Freedom Movement, in contrast to the Green Movement protests of 2009, is the international context is very different for Iran and for the struggle for democracy. And what I mean by that is that in 2022, Iran is under heavy, crippling sanctions by the United States. People are slowly slipping into poverty. The ability to sustain an internal pro-democracy movement is very difficult in the context of mass poverty and mass pauperization that is primarily a result of external American sanctions. And the Green Movement has a lot of potential in its early weeks, but it eventually is crushed because of the repressive nature of the regime, first and foremost, let there be no doubt, but also because, people in Iran, civil society, middle class in Iran is shrinking. People are struggling to survive. Iran once had a middle class, in the aftermath of the Green Movement. Iran's middle class was roughly 2/3 of the population. Now it's under 1/3. And the reason for that is, number one, it's economic mismanagement and corruption, which has always been there. But critically, when Donald Trump comes to power for the first time, he pulls out of the Iran nuclear agreement and imposes crippling sanctions on Iran that has drastic effects on society, which, in my view, fundamentally undermines the internal struggle for democracy. So that's one of the big differences. The Green Movement was very much a middle class movement. It was a movement of young people, educated people who mobilized, and there was a political opening. It was shut down very quickly, but it was difficult to sustain another moment of mass mobilization in 2022 in the context of what happened to that young woman Mahsa Amini in the context of this Women Life Freedom Movement, when the threat of war is there, sanctions are really hurting, and people are slipping into poverty. And that's, I think, instructive for where we are right now, because it's very difficult to, organize a serious, credible, organic, nonviolent movement for democracy to fight an authoritarian regime in the context of an external war, when your country is being bombed, and bombed quite savagely, but also in the context of mass poverty and mass pauperization that is a function, in this case, of American sanctions. And none of that is a recipe for, organizing a serious internal organic movement. And as I said a moment ago, I don't think the United States and even most Western leaders, and arguably most Western liberal intellectuals, really care about the question of democracy. Democracy becomes a convenient theme to mask and justify, external policies, like we're seeing right now in the context of Iran, because these same countries and individuals, as I said a moment ago, that are so passionate about the rights of the Iranian people and want them to rise up and topple what is objectively a very brutal dictatorship, those aspirations for human emancipation seemingly don't apply to anyone else in the Middle East. Particularly those countries that are ruled by pro-American dictators. So there's a lot of hypocrisy and double standards that apply here. But nonetheless, I don't think they should detract us from still focusing on the legitimate rights of the Iranian people, trying to support them. And so my view is that these two things, external acts of aggression by the United States and Israel and the internal struggle for democracy, are deeply linked and intertwined. And they're linked in the following way, that if you're serious about democracy in Iran, one of the preconditions for that to happen is you have to end this war. You have to lift the economic sanctions in order for, more appropriate social conditions to emerge internally so people can actually fight for democracy. It's not one or the other. Unfortunately, this narrative developed, including among a lot of Iranians of the diaspora, that they naively believed or were duped into believing that the only way to bring about a political opening in Iran is through an external military attack. And there was many people in the streets in Western capitals who believe this, and also people in Iran, unfortunately, who believe this as well. Now, all of those people are silent, embarrassed, exposed, don't know what to say, because their support for this war has proven to be a catastrophe and a huge disaster, first and foremost, for the average Iranian citizen.
In listening to what you just said, I was actually thinking about criticisms against Western hegemony. But I'm wondering if you're critical of those on the left who tend to romanticize what is happening in Iran as well.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I don't think one can view what's happening in Iran strictly from the prism of Western intervention, aggression, imperialism. Um, um, I think if one does that and ignores the nature of the Islamic Republic and its repressive policies toward its citizens, and to view that as sort of being separate, or negligible, or not really a problem, or worse yet, sometimes you see people apologizing and trying to justify the repression of the regime. So one of the narratives that has emerged, unfortunately, right now is this belief that the protests that happened in early January in Iran were a CIA Mossad plot, and that's all you need to know. And there was no genuine uprising. And the Iranian regime, according to some people on the far left, is a very popular government and always has had a popular mandate. Uh, you know, those claims are laughable. They don't stand up to critical scrutiny. I think one has to be able to do two things at the same time. In other words, one has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, as a close friend of mine often, says theatrically. And what that means in the context of Iran is one has to be both in strong solidarity with the people of Iran and their democratic aspirations and their effort to bring about political change nonviolently. But at the same time, one also has to be strongly critical of Western imperialism and at this current war that we're seeing right now, which is a catastrophe for the people of Iran from the perspective of international law, and also critically from the perspective of the internal struggle for democracy in Iran, because this war has set back that struggle. It has emboldened the most radical and extreme forces in Iran. And, one can't be selective in our morality and in our reference points. So one of the things that, I have friends on the left, and sometimes we engage in these debates. People are very proud and willing to quote from Amnesty International and from Human Rights Watch and from the UN Human Rights Council when it comes to Israel's grotesque and egregious violations of international law. But when those same organizations issue reports in terms of Iran's human rights record, they either ignore them, downplay them, or reject them. You can't engage in situational ethics here if you claim to be a human rights activist, or if you claim to have, moral agency. So then the question emerges: well, how do we reconcile these issues? How do we maintain a consistently moral position? I think your positionality and your location matters profoundly. So if you're an American citizen, if you're a Canadian citizen, I think you have a lot of moral reasons to be very critical and to focus on, the role that Western governments, the Canadian and the American governments, and the catastrophic role that they have been playing and are playing in the politics of Iran. Your tax dollars are supporting that. Your ability to shape events inside Iran is limited, but I think by constraining the ravages and extremist policies that we see right now from the United States, trying to roll them back, trying to first and foremost stop this war, does help the forces for democracy in Iran, because it removes the threat of external intervention, which casts a huge shadow over the Iranian country and prevents things from moving forward. And so, there's a lot more to say on this. And on the last point that I would say is that, concretely, one of the things that has to change is these broad-based punitive sanctions that have been imposed on Iran for its nuclear program, ostensibly, have to be removed because they produce, just an immense amount of suffering for the average citizen. I'm all in favor of targeted sanctions against those individuals who have blood on their hands, but these broad-based economic sanctions have to be changed. One, because they're unjust, and also because they undermine the internal struggle for democracy. So yes, this is a problem on the left. It applies not just to Iran, but in many other cases. And I think if you're on the left, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean? It shouldn't mean simply taking the opposite position to what U.S. foreign policy happens to be defending at any particular moment, right? You got to have a bigger moral vision than that. But unfortunately, for many people on the left, they sit around and they wait to see what position the United States is going to take on any issue in in the world, and then they just reflexively take the opposite position, and then they think that by definition is a moral position. I don't think it's that easy, and so I think there's work to be done here. I think most people are well motivated, but I can understand why people sometimes have that reflexive position, because what we see from the United States, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in the context of Israel, Gaza, now in Iran, and now in Lebanon, is so grotesque and is so egregious and is so outrageous and is so hypocritical. I can understand why people will just reflexively, adopt that sort of, 180-degree sort of reflexive position. But and that might be fine if you're just an activist. But for people who consider themselves to be moral and intellectual leaders, I think a higher standard is required.
When I was finishing my research in Morocco for my PhD thesis, I was writing in Austin, Texas, and I was asked to come back to NYU to teach a course called Cultures in Conflict, which I did. And the syllabus they gave me, they said, you're free to change it. It was very clear from the head of department that he was not thrilled with what this other professor was about to do. And I looked at it and I thought, I'll even it out a bit. There was Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And of course, I threw in Said, because you can't teach one without the other. And I would say that to people only teaching Said, that you ought to also teach Huntington. And I saw early on, and I am on the left, but I see within my own, let's say, leftist cohorts, great tendentiousness towards their own political views, cherry-picking answers. And I think it's really incumbent upon us as scholars, as researchers, even especially as teachers within the classroom, to push our students to think through these discussions based on rational thoughts, historical facts, facts of any nature, in fact. And I'm wondering, how do you respond to the Clash of Civilizations narrative, which I think Said took up quite well in critiquing? And where do you see the most potential interfaith dialogue between Muslims and Christians today?
Well, let me begin by saying I agree with what you just said about, pedagogy and how should one teach in the classroom. I adopt a very similar framework. If I'm teaching the Clash of Civilizations thesis, which I have done in the past, I will get students to read Sam Huntington, to expose them to the argument, to interrogate the argument. But then I ask them to read, Edward Said's response to Samuel Huntington, and to read that argument, interrogate, and then compare the two, and then try and figure out, which one is more compelling. I think that's the way one should teach. One has to sort of expose students to arguments and ideas that are out there. I do that in the context when I teach Iranian politics. Let's look at the whole debate around Iran's nuclear program. To what extent is it a threat? To what extent has Iran sort of violated international law, been an obstacle to a settlement? To what extent has Iran made concessions? What about the broader question of nuclear weapons in the Middle East? Why can't Iran have a nuclear weapon, but why can Israel have one, or Pakistan have one? So yeah, that's the way I approach things, and I encourage my students to think rationally and advance arguments that are convincing and coherent, and to weigh competing points of view. And I always try and play devil's advocate in the context of my classroom. I always try to be an agent provocateur and not reveal where I stand politically. I think that's the job of an instructor, is to be agnostic and to sort of get students to think and figure out the world on their own terms. In terms of your question on Muslim Christian understanding, could you just restate it again?
Where do you see the most potential for interfaith dialogue between Muslims and Christians? And I ask you that thinking back to Huntington, remember his division of the world into 8 different sections, and this belief that there is an inherent friction, and there shall always be.
Look, I think anytime you can get people together to talk about these issues, Muslim Christian tensions, dialogue, contradictions, debate theories like Samuel Huntington, and interrogate them, I think those are opportunities that one should pursue and not lose sight of. So you can do it in the classroom. I tend to do a lot of civil society engagement, speaking in churches, sometimes in synagogues, a lot of public libraries. I actually enjoy those types of engagements with people who are, not specialists. They're just average citizens trying to figure out the world in which we live in. I just came back from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the local World Affairs Council hosted me for a talk on Iran. It's just a general educated audience where people are interested in these issues. And you try and just talk through problems and arguments. And of course, this whole question of Muslim-Christian tensions was a big deal in the post-Cold War era, when there was a whole question of, what are the new emerging threats to the West and to the world? And that's when Huntington wrote this controversial thesis, and it had a lot of traction at the time. But of course, things then, got much more dangerous in terms of, interfaith relations or, international affairs more generally in the aftermath of 9/11, when you had 3,000 Americans that were killed, and then you had the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, and then the broader destabilization of the Middle East. That's when, everyone was interested in these debates and in these questions. The only way you can deal with them is to sort of deal with them head on, to try and explain people what's going on. And one shouldn't have any expectation that just because you give a lecture or you ask someone to read an essay that they're going to have a complete transformative reorientation of the biases that have informed their understanding of the world. Because, when you're speaking to an audience or you're teaching a group of kids in the classroom, they're hearing what you're saying. But then when they go home and they go back to their own communities, they're hearing other things on a constant basis, in many ways in a much more sustained way than, your interaction with them. So one shouldn't have any, I think, unrealistic expectations that you can change hearts and minds just because you've interacted with someone in the context of a classroom or in the context of a lecture. I think one has to just, whenever there's an opportunity to engage with an audience, you do so with as much seriousness and, homework as possible in order to maximize the opportunity. And then you just hope for the best. And these are long-term sort of, projects and efforts that one engages in. Just on a side note, I had a chance to listen to another person who I consider a mentor, John Esposito at Georgetown University, who's one of the leading experts on the whole relationship between religion and international affairs. And, he was just reflecting recently on how, the level of anti-Muslim bigotry and bias is still very high in today's America. When Zoran Mamdani was elected in New York and it looked like he was about to win, there was a major proliferation of, Islamophobic bigotry that was unleashed by his opponents. The good news is that it didn't work because he won the election. And so while you're still seeing a lot of ignorance and a lot of bias and a lot of prejudice, at the same time, I think, particularly among younger Americans, younger Canadians, there's also, I think, a much more openness and willingness to think critically and not sort of regurgitate some of the biases of their parents and their grandparents. So in that sense, there's a lot of hope.
You have advocated for an Iranian version of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How could such a framework be justified using both secular and Islamic grounds?
I don't think having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a question of a religious secular divide. What I was referring to is that if ever we get to a moment where there is a democratic opening in Iran and there is a possibility of establishing a democratic order, one of the things that Iran absolutely essentially needs is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, similar to what happened in South Africa, where instead of revenge, instead of a new series of arrests and executions, that there is an attempt at national healing, that Iranians turn the page on the very violent past that has characterized post-revolutionary politics since 1979 and then before the revolution, and an attempt to not forget, but at least forgive those people who are willing to come forward and confess their crimes. And this is the whole idea behind a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that rather than going after people and arresting them, that there is a public airing and admission of past crimes and wrongdoings, especially in front of the families of the survivors, in the hope of national healing and reconciliation and lighter sentences. And then that would then lead to national healing. And Iranians are deeply in need of this national healing and reconciliation. And the way that this could, happen would be, I think, one would have to advance the arguments. Iran has a very strong, has many prominent legal voices that could preside over something like this. But then it would also have to be justified from different perspectives, including Islamically. And the way to justify it Islamically is not that different, because if anyone knows anything about Islamic history or Islamic ethics, the whole theme of compassion, forgiveness, what's called in Arabic, mercy and compassion, Rahman and Rahim are the Arabic terms, are infused in Islamic ethics. There's a very famous story that most Muslims learn growing up, that when Prophet Muhammad flees his birthplace of Mecca and then returns to capture the town at the end of his life, he famously forgives all of his opponents and his adversaries who were trying to kill him and crush the early Muslim community in 7th century Arabia. And he does that as an act of compassion and as a representation of Islamic ethics at the beginning of the establishment of a new political order. So, people don't realize this, but they should. Religion is, all religions are multivocal. All religions have different interpretations. All religions can be utilized to justify almost anything under the sun. In this case, to justify a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and national healing and forgiveness within the framework of Islamic law and Islamic ethics, but also within the framework of secular international human rights norms and attitudes as well. So this will be the challenge if we ever get to that moment where Iranians could try and come together and undertake this process, because without it, there's so much anger and resentment and polarization that a political change can lead to another cycle of violence and revenge, just perpetuating the trauma that Iranians have been living under for a very long time. I think I would consider that very much essential to the future of a just Iran. But of course, as we see right now, the future of Iran can't be just and stable and prosperous and democratic unless there is a change in Iran's international context, which is another way of saying unless the United States radically changes its policy toward Iran and stops intervening in Iranian affairs in ways that we're seeing at this moment.
And you've explored the concept of sectarianization. To what extent is the Sunni-Shia divide a historical inevitability versus a tool used by modern political elites, especially those invested in continuing Western hegemony?
Yeah, so I've edited a book on this topic and written and spoken quite extensively on the topic. And, the book that I co-edited with my colleague Danny Postel is called Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. And it was an attempt to pick up on a very important development in Middle East politics post-Arab Spring, where there was a lot of sectarian, wars breaking out and attitudes and polarization. And so our framing in the argument of the book is that there's nothing inherent in sectarian tensions in the region. Like there is this narrative that many prominent Americans and some scholars have argued that, Islam has always been about, the Middle East has always been about sectarian conflict. Barack Obama famously said, that, the Middle East is torn by what he called ancient sectarian hatreds. And, there's nothing anyone could do about it. This was just something that the region had to, experience and then grow out of. There is a dominant narrative, more of a political narrative, meant to advance political ends than a social, scientific, scholarly narrative that has tried to suggest that one of the core characteristics of the Middle East is sectarianism. Just to say one example, the famous New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, who writes on international affairs, sought to explain the civil war in Yemen, post 2015, as a function of the 7th century uh, argument after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, where there was a split between the Muslim community, arguing that if you want to understand what was happening in Yemen in 2016, 2017, you had to go back to the 7th century. And this is a view that is very popular in the mainstream because it reinforces a lot of stereotypes about the Middle East, Muslims, Arabs, that these are just people that are living in a pre-modern mode of existence. And if you want to understand contemporary issues, you have to go back to the medieval period or the early Muslim period and figure out what went wrong there, and then you can understand what's happening in the 21st century. And then so you have a lot of people who have said this. And our argument in the book is that no, sectarianism is historically contingent. It's a recent phenomenon, and it is largely the function of the politics of authoritarianism. There are these politicians who we describe as sectarian entrepreneurs who manipulate and mobilize sectarian tensions to pursue political goals, which is, pursuing and maintaining political power. And we look at various case studies and examples. And, you have to also ask the obvious question: if sectarianism is a problem, well, when did it become a problem? And why do we see the rise of sectarian tensions in the Middle East in 2014, 2015? Or if one wants to sort of go back, maybe post-Iranian revolution, that's the key point where things change. Why was there no sectarian tensions before 1979 in the Middle East? How do we explain the historic manifestation of this behavior? And our argument is that mobilizing people around sectarian identities is a tool of authoritarian leaders to perpetuate their political role, their political power, and the longevity of their regimes. And there's a lot of cases that we see and we look at that sort of makes that claim. And it pushes back against this idea that some people naively believe that there's something inherent and foundational to this part of the world, the Middle East or the Islamic world, where sectarianism is allegedly an enduring feature. That doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. And so we try and puncture a hole in that argument.
And what impact has Western support for Mideast dictators had on the long-term prospects for human rights in the region?
Well, it's been a catastrophic impact, very simply. One of the things that most people don't realize is that the modern history of the Middle East, depending on where you want to start the clock, has been characterized by just one human rights catastrophe after another. I mean, just look at what's happening right now. A brutal genocide in Gaza that has destabilized the Middle East, a horrific genocide in Sudan, which is sort of on the periphery of the Middle East, but at least being backed by a major Middle Eastern power with, acquiescence from the West. Lebanon being devastated, Iran being devastated, but then, Palestine being devastated. Before we got to the Gaza war of post October the 7th, there was, 4 brutal attacks by Israel on Gaza that created a human rights catastrophe. But, those are not the only sites of contestation. Syria, 500,000 people were killed in the post-Arab Spring environment. In Egypt, after the Arab Spring was crushed by the military backed by the West, 1,000 people were killed in one afternoon in downtown Cairo. All of the states in the Middle East today are torture states, where torture is routine, where people are scared to speak their minds. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a human rights catastrophe. The Assad regime was a human rights catastrophe. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan. So all of these, countries. Iran today would not be Iran today had it not been for Western support for a brutal dictator who had a notorious secret police. And when people live under authoritarian repressive regimes, decade after decade, and when people, are raised in an environment where human rights violations and torture states are just routine, it produces a lot of negative consequences. It produces conspiracy theories. It undermines social harmony and social trust, which are foundational sort of principles that are needed for building a stable society. It produces anger and animosity against the people who are engaged in the torture and the repression, including it undermines relations between the Arab Islamic world and the West, because in many ways, the West, not exclusively and comprehensively, but in many cases, the West is backing these repressive regimes that are doing the torture, that is doing the violation. I mean, let's not forget that the genocide in Gaza could not have happened without strong Western military support, ongoing, by the way. Those are Western bombs that were dropped on the children of Gaza. The destruction of South Lebanon right now. I just saw a report yesterday, 2,600 people killed in Lebanon since February the 28th, killed by Western bombs. It's often ignored. Those are Western-made weapons that are doing the devastation. And so the region is deeply broken, it's deeply fractured. And of course, one of the consequences that emerges from this human rights catastrophe is the rise of extremist movements and militant movements that, recruit from the broken, the impoverished, the people who've been tortured or whose families members have been tortured or dispossessed. In many ways, the biggest winner of this catastrophe are these extremist movements who draw upon the angry and the despair and the desire for revenge to bring people around a particular narrative that seeks retribution for the pain and suffering. The United States and the West, especially now, are the prominent international actors that have shaped the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East. And that's going to, have consequences. I can't, overstate the level of anger, resentment, humiliation that people feel now after seeing this genocide in Gaza, and then in Lebanon, destruction of South Lebanon, killing of thousands of people, and now another war against Iran by the same actors, the same people, the same countries in the West more or less supporting it, the same United States and Israel. The predictable blowback effects, I think, over this moment in the history of this region are going to be catastrophic. And everyone, unfortunately, is going to pay a price. So I'm very pessimistic about where all of this is headed.
Yes. In fact, social media, once again, plays a role there. People have seen live streamed a genocide. You recently discussed his peace plan for Gaza. What are the biggest long-term hurdles to resolving the status of Hamas and the political control of Gaza? But even beyond that, I'd say in Israel's overstepping so many boundaries in what it calls self-defense, but what is to anyone with two eyes, it's aggression. And it seems to have successfully demonstrated a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when I went and did research in Israel and the West Bank, I heard many more times from Israelis from the river to the sea than I did from any Palestinian.
Yeah, look, Israel-Palestine is a disaster. I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for peace, at least in my lifetime. What's happened in Gaza is a defining moment. In the West, there's a focus on Hamas as if, Hamas emerged out of a vacuum and there's no political context to how they emerged and why they emerged. When the Secretary General of the United Nations tried to make an argument that October the 7th didn't happen without a political and historic context, that there was a history of oppression and dispossession and dehumanization that one needs to take in consideration, while not justifying the actions of Hamas, but at least understanding the broader historical context. When he made that claim, he was called an anti-Semite by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. How dare you even talk about, that, what's happening in Gaza through a historical lens. So, I think one has to have a sense of history here. One has to have a sense of fairness here. Fundamentally, you have to have a framework of analysis and interpretation that can help you understand this conflict. And there's basically two dominant frameworks that have been presented in terms of what's happening in Gaza post October the 7th. One is the dominant framework by the United States and Israel that Hamas are simply modern day Nazis, and they exist for one purpose only, and that is to kill Jews anywhere and everywhere. And that's why they undertook October the 7th, and that's all you need to know. The other framework is that there's a conflict over land in this historic piece of territory. Palestinians are indigenous to that land, and they were dispossessed by a Zionist movement that was self-described as a colonial settler project. And they dispossessed and continue to dispossess the indigenous population of Palestine, who have responded in many different ways, sometimes non-violently, unfortunately, sometimes violently. And unless one understands how occupation and dispossession produces responses that are sometimes violent, then I don't think one can really understand what's going on. I think most people, who have a sense of history and fairness, can wrap their minds around what I've just said, and the attempt to simply portray Hamas as nothing other than modern day Nazis. Doesn't help us understand what's going on in the Middle East. So that requires, an effort to try and, take on these arguments and, assess them and try and think through these issues historically, comparatively, to read what many courageous Israelis, for example, are writing today. So, Omar Bartov, who's a prominent Israeli-American scholar of genocide and Holocaust studies, has just published a new book. So, his new book is very much about recent events and why he considers what's happening in Gaza genocide, but it's also a deeper critique. That book just came out last week. It's also, a deeper critique of what went wrong in Israel and how could, the big question that he tries to grapple with as a scholar of the Holocaust and as an Israeli is, how do we explain a country that was formed in the backdrop of a Holocaust? How do we explain that country now has, committed a genocide against, a people that it's ruling over? And what does that mean for the future of Israel? So it's a profoundly introspective and insightful piece of, I think, scholarship that, people who are trying to think through these issues need to read and reflect upon. And of course, it comes from the pen of someone who's, not just an expert on genocide and Holocaust studies, but of course he's an Israeli and he's from there, and he's, tried to provide the type of deep, moral scrutiny and critique that I think Israel very much is in need of today. And I suspect that book is going to be viewed as a landmark book because, given his background and his profile and his pedigree, he can say things then and he can get a hearing in ways that, when I say the same things, no one will take seriously because of, the difference between his background and mine. So I think these are the type of things that need to happen. And thankfully, there is, I think, this healthier conversation that's happening. And in that sense, there's a reason to be optimistic.
What we've seen is also demonstrative of something that Paulo Freire, in his classic Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about. He calls it the oppressor-oppressed contradiction. And it's this belief that if you're oppressed, you can no longer be an oppressor. But of course, that is what we're witnessing. And I think it's something that is important to confront for all of our humanity, for Israelis especially. There are many worries about the future of a state that with impunity, the people are on their roofs applauding the murder of people, watching through their binoculars. That is very distressing. At the same time, we're watching the rise of global authoritarianism, not just outside of the West, but clearly within the West. And you've recently discussed, in fact, Donald Trump's peace plan for Gaza. What are the biggest long-term hurdles to resolving these, excuse me, I am so sorry, in terms of the hurdles that are facing our societies, especially Israel, I would argue, why do you believe the Israel-Palestine conflict has generated so much intense global polarization than other similar conflicts? You mentioned Sudan, the numbers of people being killed are in far greater numbers. It's far underreported compared to Gaza, but obviously Gaza is a far longer historical issue, so one can understand the reporting on that.
Your question is actually one that deeply resonates with me because in many ways it's the center of my new book project, which actually is predicated on exactly the same question. How do we explain such intense polarization, acrimony, and division on a global scale over the Israel-Palestine conflict, in contrast to other conflicts that sometimes have killed more people and that have lasted longer? How do we explain this? And my argument is that the Israel-Palestine conflict is unique in the sense that it is directly connected to two of the most powerful themes of the 20th century. Number one, the legacy of anti-Semitism, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust and the attempt to provide restitution to Jews around the world for the horrors of the past. And so that whole legacy is one of the biggest themes of the 20th century. But the other big theme of the 20th century is the theme of decolonization and the struggle for independence and dignity from people who are living under European colonial rule. And in Israel-Palestine, these two themes come together in a dramatic way. And they explain why, at least as we saw after October 7th, the official Western response was very much to respond to what happened on October the 7th from the prism of this first framework that I just mentioned. You know, Joe Biden said famously that what happened on October the 7th was the biggest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. That was the framework, and that's how many people responded. From the perspective of people in the global South and in the Arab Islamic world, their approach to the question of October the 7th was through the prism of decolonization and the struggle for independence. And the question of Palestine, or Israel-Palestine, is one of the few remaining areas in the world where the final status of the Palestinian people and their national rights, and where a future Palestinian state might be, it still remains to be resolved. And when you look at what's happening in Gaza right now, and when you look at what's happening in Israel and in the West Bank right now, it's a replay for many people in the global South of a narrative that is eerily familiar, of colonization, of dispossession, of humiliation. Whenever war breaks out in Israel-Palestine, the same countries that were the former colonial imperial powers rally to support, back, finance, and arm Israel, and to portray any resistance to Israeli policy as being violent, a form of terrorism, backwardness, in any ways to reproduce a narrative that is identical to the narrative that existed in the struggle for decolonization. So if you look at, for example, the Mau Mau rebellion that took place in Kenya, where there was a revolt against British colonial occupation of Kenya, and Britain tried to repress that rebellion. The arguments and the justifications and the claims were identical to what we see right now in the context of Israel-Palestine. Why don't these people recognize the magnanimity and the generosity of the British project in Kenya, and how it's trying to civilize and advance and bring people forward and promote modernity? And resistance to that project is considered to be inherently violent and a form of terrorism. The idea of moral virtue being embodied in one side of the equation, and the moral depravity being embodied in the people who are resisting imperialism. All of these themes that we're seeing in Israel-Palestine today map very easily onto a broader colonial and imperial legacy. And that's why I think the Israel-Palestine conflict, in many ways, even though a lot of people have been killed, but other conflicts have killed more people, the reason why this issue produces such passion and intensity is because of what I just said a moment ago, because many people in the global South can relate to the story of Palestinian suffering, because it was foundational to the modern identities of many countries in the global South in terms of their struggle for independence from Western countries, and the portrayal of resistance to colonialism through this language of terrorism and double standards and hypocrisy. All of that we've seen before in the broad Western engagement and attempt to control large parts of Africa and Asia. And we're seeing it happen again in live time in 2026 in Gaza and in the West Bank, with no sign that it's going to end. And so that's why it mobilizes people in the global South, and it mobilizes young people who are, in the West, who are sensitive to these themes of historic injustice. And I think that's what's unique about Israel-Palestine.